This episode is brought to you in partnership with the Colorado chapter of the Nature Conservancy and TNC chapters throughout the western United States. Guided by science and grounded by decades of collaborative partnerships, the Nature Conservancy has a long-standing legacy of achieving lasting results to create a world where nature and people thrive. During the last week of every month throughout 2025, Mountain and Prairie will be delving into conversations with a wide range of the Nature Conservancy's leaders, partners, collaborators, and stakeholders, highlighting the myriad of conservation challenges, opportunities, and solutions here in the American West and beyond. To learn more about the Nature Conservancy's impactful work in the West and around the world, visit www.nature.org. This is the Mountain and Prairie Podcast. I'm Ed Robertson. My guest today is Chris Pague. Chris is the Senior Conservation Ecologist for the Nature Conservancy, and he's deeply involved in so many of the topics we discuss here on the podcast: grasslands, bison, endangered species, landscape scale conservation, and more. For many decades now, Chris has been working on the front lines of TNC's science-based conservation efforts, and during his tenure, he's accumulated a mind-blowing amount of knowledge about everything from the tiniest prairie plants to the plains' largest mammals. But what makes Chris so special is his ability to translate complex ecology into inspiring, impactful stories that resonate with everyone from the most committed conservationists to people who are just beginning to learn about the West's wild places. Chris grew up in Virginia, and for as long as he can remember, he's been obsessed with the outdoors, wild creatures, and all varieties of plants. He eventually moved west to take a job in Colorado with the Nature Conservancy, where he's been an invaluable member of the team ever since. I personally credit Chris for helping me in my own journey to understand the importance of grasslands and connected landscapes across the southern high plains, thanks to a presentation Chris gave at an event I was attending over a decade ago. And I know there are countless other folks like me who credit Chris with helping them to better understand and appreciate pressing conservation issues, and more importantly, to take action. Between his on-the-ground ecology work and his gift of storytelling, it's difficult for me to fully wrap my head around the scale of the positive impact Chris has had over his career. So I was long overdue in having Chris join me for a podcast conversation. We could have talked for many hours, but in this chat, we still managed to cover a lot, including Chris's upbringing in Virginia and some of our shared favorite Virginia landscapes, his decision to move to Colorado, the decades-long shift in thinking around grasslands conservation, the importance of storytelling to communicate critical science, TNC's Southern High Plains Initiative, optimism and the wisdom of Ted Lasso, partnerships and relationships, favorite books, and much more. Be sure to visit the episode webpage for a full list of the topics we discuss, links to everything, and a new short film that features Chris and some of the landscapes he works to protect. A huge thanks to Chris for this wonderful conversation, but more importantly, thanks to Chris for his many decades of inspiring work. Hope you enjoy. All right, Chris, we were talking a little bit before we started recording, and I was saying that I've had the pleasure of seeing you speak in person on several occasions, and then whenever I happen to type anything into YouTube that I want to learn about, whether that's grasslands or bison, the videos pop up, and most of them are featuring you. So I'm really glad. I've long overdue to have you here on the podcast. But the one thing I don't know about is I detect a slight Southern accent like mine, and I don't know where you're from. I don't know how you ended up getting out west. So can we start at the beginning? You tell me where you grew up?
Yes, I will. And I'll start with this. When I did my interview to come to Colorado with the Nature Conservancy, restarting the Colorado Natural Heritage Program, I sat on a rock in the Flatirons out there, and I said, "What are you doing? You've been working for more than 30 years in Virginia. You've got the natural history. You know every stream and creek in there. What are you doing? Are you really going to do this?" And I said, yes, sitting there looking east. And so that's how I got here. And then how I got to be who I am.
Yeah.
My mom would say that from the time I got in the backyard and I could see enough distance between the slats in the fence, I was a wild man. I was out in the fields, the neighbors' yards, the gardens, anything I could be. And so I'm just one of those kids that I think back and I can remember almost always trying to be or being in nature. And I can remember, I don't know if anybody that's listening to this remembers the great big giant book, The Birds of America.
Yeah.
And that book and my dad's old big heavy binoculars that were focused on the eye at a time were how I learned to get into birds, and birds led me to the outdoors. And of course, when you're in the outdoors, you start seeing everything, not just the birds. So that's how I got into it. I went to school at Virginia Tech.
Oh, that's beautiful.
It's gorgeous Southern Appalachians mountains. I learned about the biodiversity there. I got out of that, and here's a funny one for you. I'm glad it didn't turn into a career track, but I sold Royal Crown Cola.
Did you really? RC Cola?
Yeah. And I did that as a part, it just to get a work because it was tough. That was the end of the Vietnam period, and there were a lot of people that were taking the jobs. They had government points, and I give them all the credit in the world for that. There's nothing wrong with it, but it made it tough to get a job. And so anyway, I did that. I couldn't stand it for about 7 months. I found myself slowing traffic down on the interstate, crossing over the Chesapeake Bay and the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel, watching birds.
Yeah.
So anyway, that led to, I just said, well, I got to do it myself. So I went and took a very low paying zoo job and got to really practice my one-on-one with a lot of different kinds of animals. And I loved it. And I'm telling you the long end of the story, but I'll cut it as short as I can.
No, this is a podcast. We can talk as long as we want.
And then I just decided that the only way I was going to get a job in the field that I loved, which was, getting out and finding biodiversity, was to become an expert. And the only way I was going to become an expert was on my own personal time. And so I'd get off at the zoo job about 3:30 in the afternoon, go home, get a quick bite to eat, and drive out somewhere in the wilds and chase amphibians and reptiles. So I became an expert in the amphibians and reptiles. Then I got a call from the Nature Conservancy. Said, hey, we got a job for you to do. And then from that, I went to the Virginia Natural Heritage Program as their zoologist for 5 years. And then I got that call for Colorado, which said, hey, why don't you apply for this job for starting up this heritage program in Colorado? And so I did. And that's why I'm here.
I've got a soft spot for Virginia because I'm from North Carolina. And
I bless your heart.
Wake Forest, which is in Winston-Salem. But I mean, every weekend I would go up kind of New River Valley area and like Grayson Highlands and all area up there. And I feel like some of my fondest memories are from Grayson Highlands and the Appalachian Trail that runs through there. What are kind of some of your favorite spots in Virginia, if you could pick one or two?
Well, you just hit something that you and I have in common then, because it's there's two things I say about grasslands that really prepared me, I think, for coming to the Colorado area. One of them was the eastern shore of Virginia with all those giant salt marshes, which are just, salty grasslands. And then the other one is Grayson Highlands.
Really?
And that whole Mount Rogers, Grayson Highlands area and all the balds. I visited most of the balds in North Carolina, Tennessee and all that. And I just loved it. It was just that open air, the wind just in a different way. It was just amazing to me.
Well, that's interesting because we both kind of felt a connection to that. And I feel like that's about as close as a feeling you can get to being out west at least in the Southeast, is those open balds on top with the horses running around and everything. I mean, it really does have, in a way, a Western feel. So you get the call from TNC to move to Colorado, or you decide to head out this way. Can you talk more about that decision? Because I mean, I would imagine it's a big deal in a lot of ways to move across the country, but especially when your career involves knowing so intimately a landscape and the flora and the fauna and all that. I mean, can you talk about that process of making that decision?
Yeah, the actual application process was, it was exciting. I'd been out here only a couple of times, spent some time in Rocky Mountain National Park. Like everybody else, apparently in the world, I drove through the prairie really fast.
Yeah.
and got to the mountains, and boy, elk and all the wildlife that Colorado is so well known for. So that was all fun. And I would say that the Nature Conservancy runs a rigorous interview process, and that was
Yeah.
not necessarily fun, but I'm not that bashful, so at least I talked a lot. And so I think that was that, that got me through the interview. And there's some people that you would recognize, Dave Armstrong, Sidney
Mhm.
Macy, and others on that team that were, just, that actually they ended up asking me to stay. But the process, once I got out and the reality hit me, my family was back in Virginia.
Okay.
And that was going to be hard. And then my whole network of experts, not the whole one, but a lot of them were back in Virginia. I mean, those are the people I knew. Knew the freshwater clams and the millipedes of the southern Appalachians and all the caves that were there. And I could go through the long list. But bottom line is I knew that. I didn't really know Colorado, although
Mhm.
I have this whole thing of what I do in these days is rapid ecological assessments for landowners. And that is the same process I use whether I'm going to a new country or a new state or a new ecosystem or a new property, of thinking about it. And so I thought, well, you can do this. You know how to do this. You just got to spend the time on it and be willing to travel. And so
Mhm.
that's what that process was. And when I made that decision and they made the offer, crazy as it might have been, I was there. And I loved it ever since. I say I'm happily stuck in Colorado.
Yeah, I know the feeling.
Yeah.
Like when I moved out here, I was obsessed with the big mountains.
Oh
That's
yeah.
everything revolved around spending time in the mountains, and that was the main driver of why I moved out here. But then this slowly over time, I started realizing the magic of the plains and of grasslands, and started reading more about it. And you actually played a role. I'll tell you about that in a minute in my understanding of grasslands. But I'd love to hear if you had a similar experience. Like, can you talk about your kind of the evolution of your understanding of grasslands? Because nowadays, you're one of the best people around to talk about grasslands, but I imagine it wasn't always the case.
No, if you wanted to talk about Mount Rogers and the Eastern Shore of Virginia, I could hack with you. But no, it was my job in the Natural Heritage Program. The Natural Heritage Program is set up to say, where are the most intact places out there in the state, and why are they special? And that includes all the rare and imperiled species,
Mm-hmm.
not just the legally ones, but the things that maybe a lot of people haven't thought of, like the snails and certain groups of insects that are fairly well known. But then, of course, all the mammals, the birds and fish and everything. And so, a lot of people's information. It wasn't like we went out and collected all new data, but we collected a lot of new data. And when you looked at the maps, that's the beauty of this. And in those days, they were still the manual topo maps.
Mm-hmm.
But when you finally could get those on a map, there was one thing that was real apparent, and that was there was almost no protection and almost very little biological study in the Great Plains. Everybody goes to the mountains. They're gorgeous. They're refreshing. They're full of wild open lands. But that private sector of lands out there and the lack of protection caught my attention. And I've always had an attraction for arid lands. The few times that I'd actually been traveling to the Sonoran Desert, the Chihuahuan Desert, and others in my life, but it struck me that this was an area that we could make a big difference in. And so I started wandering around, and like everybody else, the gnats, the bugs, everything's kind of tough at first when you're not used to it. But being up at dawn, hearing that group of birds with the spotlight at night, checking and seeing all the little mammals out there, moths that you've never seen before when they come to the light around your campsite and all that. It's just, it's like a biodiversity wonderland of sorts. It's not Costa Rica, but it has the uniqueness of Costa Rica when you actually look at it. And that was the phenomenal part. And so since that time, we have created a kind of a much stronger knowledge, not just me, of course, but a lot of people. But when you pull it together, the grasslands stand on their own as a critical place out there with amazingly adapted wildlife that we don't even understand. I mean, Ed, you drove across that thing 1,000 times, and you look out there, and during a drought in particular, it's pretty rugged looking stuff.
Oh yeah.
But if you maybe you stop at the truck stop and you're looking out across the fence line and you're drinking on a cold drink and you think, man, how on earth does that life out there survive in this? How can they take the drought, and when we get a rainstorm 3 years later, all those wildflowers are popping up and the birds are singing again and the insects are going at it? How does that happen? And to me, that's just one of the most amazing things about life on Earth, is how does it survive?
Well, one of my kind of formative experiences with grasslands, and you may not even remember this, but it was many, many years ago, and TNC, I think GOCO, the Cattlemen's Land Trust, they had an event, like an overnight event at the J.E. Canyon Ranch, which TNC owned at the time. And I was invited out to that, and I went, and you gave a presentation not only about grasslands, but about TNC's work across the Southern High Plains. And you had all these amazing maps. And it was really the first time I was really able to understand the importance, both the importance from a biodiversity standpoint, but also the importance of the work that TNC is doing on the Southern High Plains and how it all kind of connects together. And I really do. I think about that all the time. It was just such a fun 2 days out there on the J Canyon Ranch, and there were like sandhill cranes flying around at night. It was just a awesome deal. But your presentation is what I remember. And so, kind of an open-ended question for you that you could probably talk for hours about. But for people who don't understand why grasslands are so important, I mean, I think everybody's heard that they're important. But what is how do you explain to people this is why it's so important? This is why TNC is investing so many of its resources. This is why this ecosystem is really critical for life on Earth, really.
Well, this is a great, and like you say, I could talk for a long time about it, and I'm not sure that anybody wants to hear me talk that long. So
I do.
Well, first of all, I appreciate the feedback on that. That was a special place, J.E. Canyon Ranch, for so many reasons. And part of it was because of the diversity of things that live out there and the habitats that are there. Everything from river to steep rocky canyon walls with golden eagles and peregrine falcons nesting on it, to the grasslands up there with cassin sparrows and lark buntings, and then the rare frogs in the little pools in all the little side canyons. It's just it's taken adventure into that. And then now that we're smarter and have looked around more, we can also look into the past and see, indigenous people's signs that they left behind, and hopefully we'll learn better even how to read those signs and interact in a way that really capitalizes on that knowledge and that art that was there. But when I talk about it, first of all, it depends on the group. You have to shape a conversation, as you know better than anybody, about this. But almost everybody, whether from a spiritual aspect or from just oh my gosh, isn't life on Earth fun, to a thing about, for getting inspired by biological diversity, any of those aspects, if you talk about the amazing things that are out there, you don't have to talk about all of them, but a few of them. And if you can show them, that's all that much better. But they start to get an opening in their heart and their mind that you want to watch them and fill it as best you can. And that's the way that I work with this. If it's a rattlesnake, there are so many amazing things about a rattlesnake. But a rattlesnake's one out of about 30 or so snakes out there. So there's a lot more to talk about. And most people don't know that a coach whip can be up in that pine tree you're walking under. Mm-hmm. And they don't want to know it. but they're pretty amazed when they think about snakes climbing like that. And with rattlesnakes, when they start talking about the less than a 1 degree centigrade difference in temperature, and they can detect it with their heat glands. And if you caught one, which I don't do much of that anymore, but when you do and you show somebody that heat sensing glands on their head. It's pretty amazing. And people just get inspired by it. And I think one of the jobs of all the scientists is we have to be enthusiastic to inspire people.
Yes.
We have to exude love and excitement and challenges and some hardships. But I think that's a key for all of us. And I think it's contagious.
That brings me to a question that's further down on my list, but you teed it up for me perfectly. I'd love to know more about how you're such a great storyteller and you're so great at communicating these very complex topics into a way that makes sense. Has that always been a gift of yours? I mean, obviously you've worked on it as a skill, but any lessons learned along the way as you've been telling these stories to figure out ways to connect them with people better than just straight up scientific data in their face?
I was, everybody says this about themselves. I was such a shy kid. Well, I wasn't shy, but I wasn't going to go out and have an open public conversation. But that was a different time in the 1950s and 60s when we went to Sunday school and church and we memorized things and we joined the choir and we went out and sang in the choir. And sometimes there was a solo. And so, those things, and then later on in high school, theatrical stuff, musicals and all that, it built something. And I'd say that the theatrical in particular in my life, but I would say for the music or anything else, you got to be looking at who you're talking to and seeing the response, because that's what you want. I wanted my daughter when she was growing up to be so excited. And if she wasn't, I could see it in her face. Mm-hmm. And so I think that really helped me in developing that. And then I believe that the other part is I spend enough time. I'm not telling somebody else's story most of the time. It's actually something that I experienced. I saw, I watched it. I sometimes felt it and touched it.
Yep.
And I think that's, getting the kids outside is one thing, but I think every teacher needs to be outside. And, the ranchers are already out there, so they got a hands up on all of us in terms of observation and love of that land. But I think that's a real key. We got to get out there and actually experience it. And if you're scared of experiencing some of the things that I've experienced, you can at least get a lounge chair out there in the shade of a pinyon pine in this case, and just sit out there and smell it and feel it and watch the sunset.
Speaking of growing up in the South and doing choir at church, when my mom used to drop me off for choir practice when I was a kid, and I'd wave goodbye and she'd drive off, and then I'd dive in the bushes and hide in the bushes and I would never go in.
Oh man.
So that's the opposite of enthusiasm there.
Yeah. A different kind of enthusiasm for sure.
Yeah. When I was preparing for this, I found a really great presentation that you had done with the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. I think it was right in the middle of the pandemic, maybe. But you showed this great map of conserved lands in Colorado in the 70s, and then conserved lands, I guess that probably would have been 2021. And there's just this huge increase, whether you're talking about government lands or privately owned conserved lands with conservation easements, some of the TNC acquisitions. Could you just give the listeners and me a history lesson of kind of that big push in land conservation over the last, 40, 50 years?
Yeah. Ed, there's two stark things out there that I remember. And one of them was finding out that just slightly less than 1/2 of all the grasslands have been converted to an alternate use. And I'm not the type of person who would say any of those uses are bad, but I would say that if you've converted a grassland, whether it's farming or urban areas, which is common, the ex-urban areas and all those things, the grasslands have been changed. And there's the way that they function no longer is the same. And so that was the first thing as I looked at that compared to the Rocky Mountains and even the BLM lands on the western slope and all that. And there's just the opportunity for conservation, or you could flip that and say the losses, even if it's only in numbers, of the biological species that live out there is just striking. And so that was the first thing. And then the second one was that early map in the 70s, as you probably remember, there was, other than government land, the national grasslands, primarily a couple of national parks. At that time, we didn't even have the Front Range wildlife refuges. There was almost nothing that was in the protected category. Mm-hmm. So not only did we have almost a 50% loss, the rate of loss, as you know, Colorado has been growing just super fast for 30 years. And so that is the risk that we're seeing. And again, the risk is in the sense of how much do we need to protect? And that's what I was most interested in, is how could we use the best science we've got, the best natural history observers, and all of that to look at that was least protected out there and say, what do we need? Where do we need it? And how do we get it going? And so that later picture, which of today, about, I think 2024, 2022 is when I gave that presentation, would be that with our friends and colleagues now, people like the Colorado CCALT and just so many of our other friends and colleagues out there, in other NGOs, we have all combined to protect almost 700,000 acres in that time period. And when I say protect, it's in various forms, but basically I think that when somebody's driving across Colorado and headed towards Colorado Springs, toward that great big peak up there, there's going to be a lot of times when they're going through land that will forever support whatever biodiversity can live with us.
It's an inspiring story. I mean, just comparing those two maps and seeing the work you all have done. And, a while back, I think it was several years ago, actually, I had Matt Moorhead and Galen on the podcast, and we were talking a bit about the Southern High Plains Initiative. And for people who may not have listened to that, I'd encourage you to go back and listen, because Matt is another mentor of mine, and he's just been doing such great work for so many years. But could you talk a bit about TNC's, that initiative, how it came to be, how TNC as a global organization decided to focus its resources in on this region that encompasses quite a few states, but this massive ecosystem that's so threatened?
Yeah, this is, you're talking about a couple of my favorite people on the world now. So it'd be really easy for me to talk about Matt and Galen.
Yeah, the best.
Yeah. So when it was, I'm trying to think about the years, it would have been in the late 1990s was my first trip out to the J.E. Canyon area, basically. And it was a potential protection project that could go on. And I had wandered in that landscape, mostly driving roads. People in those days, there was a little more friction between people coming out. And that our first office was in Boulder, Colorado. That wasn't the most agriculturally friendly town in the world. And so when I would drive up to a what I thought was on the map, a public road, and found out I was in somebody's yard, it was a little bit challenging. But when I visited enough places out there, what I started seeing was, good grief, this landscape is just big, wide open and full of life. And this is worthy of something to last. But then a little later, this volunteer showed up in the Nature Conservancy's office on Pine Street in Boulder. And he was a lawyer who had hiked the Appalachian Trail. Well, of course, the Appalachian Trail is in my home. It's part of it. And so that was Matt Moorhead. And I heard him talking about something. He was an assistant legal person in our program there as a volunteer. And I heard him say something about grasslands. And I said, after he got off the phone, I said, so you're interested in grasslands, huh? I got something to show you. And so we took that trip out to the J.E. Canyon area, which was then the Reinhard Ranch and the Sharp Ranch and a couple of other ones. And I knew enough about the area, so I parked the vehicle and I walked across the mesa, through the grasslands, then into the pine trees and junipers. And then all of a sudden that big view opened up, which you've seen.
Mm-hmm.
And that view down in the canyon and looking across at Mesa de Maya and everything, which I had by that time been to most of those sites, I said, Matt, not only was he stupefied by it all, but by that time I looked out and I said, Matt, why doesn't this all fit together? And why aren't we working at a bigger scale? But it wasn't formed. It was just, it just knew it was big. That's what wildlife needed, whether you're talking about the big cats or whether you're talking about, the elk and the deer. There weren't many elk down there at that point in time. They've come back since then, but we started to see a bigger vision, and Matt just jumped on that. And Matt is hungry for a new idea. He wants it. And so then we started. It took a long time, because the program, the Nature Conservancy, like anybody else, doesn't take but so much fiscal risk.
Yeah.
And so to think about that, and then there's also, we have a policy about willing sellers. And so finding willing sellers at an acceptable risk is a challenge that was outside of my scientific purview.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, we started seeing that. And then later, even when I could have showed that map of before when it was 500,000 or 300,000 acres, we knew it wasn't enough, Ed. We really knew it wasn't enough. And so we started thinking about how to do this. And we're meeting with Nature Conservancy people. And here's the striking thing to me. The Nature Conservancy has more than 75 programs around the world, and we have 50 in the United States. And that's a pretty remarkable thing that we've been able to maintain it. I think we should be happy about that. But we all worked independently. And so some states were bigger than others and more powerful in certain areas, the real estate side, the government relations side, or the science side. And so we sat in a room, we called everybody together from those 5 states that now know as the SHPE, Southern High Plains Initiative states. And we asked the question, what if we acted like we were one group, so that if we had some extra science capacity here in Colorado and Oklahoma didn't have adequate to do certain jobs or enough jobs, and what if we had the real estate capabilities combined across these states and that kind of thing? And basically that's what started that process. We knew we needed to be bigger. We knew that the rate of protection was inadequate to get that kind of big. And the conversation about wildlife moving and yes, climate change to me is one of the primary drivers, but it's also wildlife has been moving since eternity.
Sure.
And so it's going to move. So how do we give it not only the room to move, but the ways to get there, the paths and the corridors? And that led to a lot of science studies and things that we did internally and with partners. And so the Southern High Plains program was basically formed out of that thinking of, oh my gosh, this has got to get bigger. There's not enough protection. What if we got together and did something new? And what if the science actually gave us better information about how much, where, and when we had to do things and for what? And that's where we are today. And it's a pretty remarkable, I think it's one of the most remarkable programs I've seen in my lifetime in the United States, at least.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, and I think the scale of it and the impact that y'all have been able to have, you and your various partners, over a relatively short period of time, you've been able to really, like, if you look at, I've seen graphs of the conserved acreage, and it kind of goes up, goes, and then it's almost like a hockey stick as far as it really going up. And I really do credit, I've said this before, but I credit you and Matt Moorhead, and obviously there are many, many, many other teammates, but I feel like both of y'all have really gone all in on those communities out there, and it takes a while to build up that trust.
Yeah.
With folks. I mean, over a decade, I would guess, for people to be like, oh, well, there's Chris, there's Matt, I know them. And it's really remarkable. When you think about, or when you're trying to describe to somebody how you protect these landscapes, I know you do it a lot of different ways, but if somebody said, okay, so y'all are focused on this area, what does that mean, protecting land? Like, how do you actually do it? Can you walk through a few of the different scenarios that TNC and its partners use to protect these lands?
it's like I said, it was really clear to us that the rate of protection needed to go bigger and the scale needed to go bigger. And that would allow for more of the wildlife. And then we needed to be thinking about places that were pinch points in the landscape, that even though they weren't big, these are the wildlife crossings, which most people would know them up in the mountains in particular. But out here, they're just maybe a stream that's pretty dry most of the time these days rather than 50 years ago. But it's a little bit of native habitat that wildlife will, given a chance over time, make it across that. And all we need, right, to start it is one male and one female. So that's basically it. And what we started doing also was realizing a couple of key things, and that is we will never buy it all. And the Nature Conservancy is just a super optimistic organization, and we kept doing that for a long time. So the buy and hold as a nature preserve is hugely expensive. And when we look at the major risk to the biological diversity out there, the major risk remains that if there's no habitat or altered habitat that's not as satisfactory for the things that live there, then the conservation issue changes entirely from a biological diversity and saving nature to something different, open space. And we've got plenty of open space out there, but the Nature Conservancy is super committed to all life, the human parts and the wildlife and even the plants and fungi and everything else out there. And we know it's a daunting task, but we think we have a pathway. And this pathway is now when property comes up for sale as an alternate use, we used to ask the question, can we afford it? I mean, why wouldn't you as a fiscally run organization, oh my gosh, that's $20 million. We can't afford that. One of the things Matt and Galen have done is turned our thinking to not, and I'd say Brad Corey. I don't want to forget Brad. Brad's up in Steamboat.
Brad, he's great.
He's amazing. And so when you put those three together, when the biology, I might go out and say, this is an amazing place. This is essential. Our maps have done the analysis. It's essential that we do this. But oh my gosh, that price. The thing is, it's essential. Okay, I got the price. Now the question now is not how big is the price, it's how are we going to raise it?
Yeah.
I mean, and that's a fundamental difference. Mm-hmm. And so that's where we are in this system. And it goes back to the 5 states together, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Texas, especially the panhandle part of Texas, Colorado, and Kansas. The 5 states together have more power to think through that problem and to actually hit the fundraising targets that we need to do it. And then we had one other fundamental shift in our thinking, and that is, if you look at the movement of assets around, so we're going to purchase the property. We figured out how to raise the money, but now we've got to manage that money with as much or more care in some cases than we are managing the wildlife or the biological diversity or the grazing or anything on that ranch. And the best thing to do with the biggest threat still the same out there, loss of habitat, is why don't we sell this to a competent owner with a conservation easement that will limit their ability to destroy it, but empower them with the information to manage that property so that we can take those assets and go to the next place.
Yep.
And that rollover is phenomenal. And we had one more thing, which is you'll find interesting, and this is way out of my ballpark here when I'm talking about it, but we found really quickly that in the private sector, when a big or important or beautiful piece of land comes up for sale, it goes fast. And we weren't always very fast. And so now we have to let people know we're in the game and we're a successful buyer. We're not just saying we're interested. We're a successful buyer. And that has really paid off in the sense that we usually get to see a piece of land. We might meet the landowner, but at the very least, we're talking to the brokers about the possibility. And that's an important relationship with people, that many of these people don't want to have to sell the land. So having a relationship is an important way of understanding each other. So anyway, it's a big, complicated thing when you put it together, but it's a significant change. 5 states acting together, even though they still have individual programs, as though they were functioning one unit, a new model for economics. And, our biological information is always improving. With that rapid ecological assessment is one of the first things we do on the property. Is this something we should be concerned about, or is it somebody else's job?
Well, I clearly remember when I was at Murr Ranch Group, when Murr Ranch Group had the Jay Canyon Ranch for sale, and Matt came over to talk about it and ultimately make the offer. And, I had been involved in several different, transactions where a nonprofit wanted to buy land, and it's like, well, we need to keep it under contract for a year and a half, and we need to do all this kind of stuff. And I think Matt came in, and it was, I don't remember the details, but it was faster than a lot of private buyers would move. And everybody he was like, yep, this is the amount of due diligence. And then we close. And everybody's like, oh, okay. I mean, it was really amazing to see. And then even more amazing to see, what y'all did with it, and then able to sell it and move on to the next one. But then that brings me to a question. Jay Canyon was such a magical place, as are all the places you guys are involved with. What's the decision process of reselling it, putting the easement, conserving it, selling it, versus keeping a place as a preserve? Like I think most people who listen to this know of the Medno Zapata Ranch, and that's obviously been under TNC's ownership for quite a while now. How do you decide what you want to keep versus what you want to sell?
I'll dabble in this a little bit, but it's, as you can imagine, we've got many programs in the Nature Conservancy. We need to have a good functional relationship with our legislative bodies, and all that. And that is, it's a fundraising challenge. I'll just call it, because every year we raise our own budget. And so we have that, and there are many other programs like that. And then we have our water program out in the West Slope, and we have other ones. And, the bottom line, Ed, is all of those programs are important and have a role, but not all of them might generate the same amount of assets to run themselves. And so that's one side that I'm not too involved with, because I would say we are, because the science program really, it doesn't bring any money in. We are, receiving the benefits of our fundraising and other capacities. So when we get a property, there's all kinds of, there's the marketing program, because there's very few properties that I've worked on that would sell better visually and emotionally than J.E. Canyon or the Great Sand Dunes area. They're remarkable. And there are other ones as well. So we would, if we had all the money we wanted, we would of course keep more of them. But we have to, if we do that, we got to hire staff. In most cases, we've got to make sure that we have some facilities for bringing staff in. At least that's the thinking of today. And so we have to make that decision compared to what is our interim goal in terms of what do we want to achieve and accomplish here that will make conservation success more likely, but at the same time will also show that we have the highest integrity with the people that we almost always lease our lands out for grazing. We want to have a functional relationship and a two-way relationship with those people. We have to make sure that the land is managed well. So that's all kinds of things. We have to balance those things. And so it was a tough decision with J.E. Canyon. And I was not in the room when the decision was made. And maybe that's a good thing for everybody. But the decision made it possible for us to do a lot of conservation that we otherwise would not have done. And at the same time, we've got a manager or an owner out there who's living with the easement and just doing wonderful things with it. So that's kind of a win-win if you look at the long-term vision for that many. I mean, our goal is by 2030, 2 million protected acres. We've got about 700,000, probably closer to 800,000 acres now. We've got a long way to go. And so, and there's one other thing about easements that I used to think the easement was both the protection and the management tool. And we did some easements like that. The landowners were willing. We played that game. But the real thing is an easement stops and makes sure that that land is still there, that the wildlife, it has terms in it that we believe will successfully make sure that the wildlife is there. And land ownership and thoughts and philosophies and even needs in the future are going to change. They always do. And so that putting that land in that stasis, that state where we can come back later and continue having that conversation and probably make greater progress over the long run and in a way that's more compatible with the way we want to work with friends and colleagues and neighbors.
Well, that brings me back to something you mentioned earlier. You said, when you were starting out, maybe and you're driving around out in eastern Colorado, coming in from Boulder, there could be a bit of a challenge, kind of breaking down those preconceived notions. And I lived in Boulder for quite a while. I remember I was at a cattleman's land trust event one time, and I jokingly, like real loud, said, "Are there any vegan options here? I live in Boulder," and it got mixed laughs.
I'll bet it
But yeah, but how can you talk about any ways that you found to break down some of those preconceived notions? Because I feel like that is one of the things every single person I've had from TNC on here, it's about building relationships. And, but that can take on a million different varieties, So in your experience out there in eastern Colorado, how did you go about breaking that down? Because then you got the Southern accent on top of it, which I can, I understand how that goes.
Yeah. Oh, it was pretty interesting in those first years where, not only was I an unknown, but conservationists in that part of the world were not necessarily thought of well. And so there are several prongs to this. One of them was in the past, Kirk Hanna, who's now passed, was on the board of the Nature Conservancy in Colorado, and he kind of took me under his wings and really helped me understand a little bit about the ranching business. Now, there's no way a seashore-loving, seafood-eating guy from Virginia could ever quite get all that, but he showed me an awful lot, and he introduced me. He talked about how most of the landowners out there cared, but they had not been treated well necessarily. And so we had to create a new relationship. And he was an expert at that. He also took me across his land because he knew I had an interest in prairie dogs and I knew they were controversial. He took me out there and he had a hot wire around it to keep the cattle off of his prairie dog town. And so he went and stepped on it one day. And then he told me the story about how one day that thing slipped off of his boot and came up and caught him. So he cautioned me about electric wires and their negative side. But that was one part of it, was key people in my life that have done that. I would say another one is Joy and Steve Wooten.
Yep.
And the Jacksons out in that part of the world. But Joy Wooten in particular and Steve, they invited Matt and I. We went out there and looked around. And of course, while they were doing their conversation, I went outside and caught a lizard. And it happened to be a really rare lizard that's only found in Colorado, nowhere else in the world. And so I was very proud of myself, and I brought it in the house and showed them. And Joy said at the end of that little demonstration, "Chris, this is very interesting, but we don't bring animals in the house." So my naivete was just, I think caught people off guard that this is not some snooty academic that's out here. This is a real person. And I think that's just so we got to be genuine. Yeah. And then the final piece of this, Ed, is that these guys, grazing and livestock have made big changes in the West from what it was, even with bison there. I mean, bison did it differently. They did a lot of the same things, but they did it differently. why would we ever, when you get to know the folks out there, why would you ever think that they're intentionally trying to damage something?
Yeah.
They're trying to manage it. They've got the same problems we do. They've got a family. They want to go to college or school or some kind of a business. They would love to see their kids continue in that vein. We know that's been a challenge. So that's having that genuine respect is really critical. And whether I've taken those lessons from Eastern Colorado's prairie with me to Mongolia, to Argentina, to Australia and other places, as, hey, these guys, yes, there were some bad things that happened, but these people of today are trying to make a living, and they deserve the ability to try and make that living in the same way that all of us do. So I think that's my lessons about that is you got to be genuine. You got to sit down and talk, drink coffee, have a beer, sip a little whiskey or whatever it is, but you got to do it genuinely.
Yep.
You got to really believe. That's a Ted Lasso thing, right?
Yeah.
Just believe.
Well, speaking of Ted Lasso, he's the ultimate optimist. And I think that, that show, I just absolutely loved that show, and it came at such a perfect time.
Oh my gosh.
I'm always curious about people, their operating system, whether they're optimists or whether they may not be born that way, but they force themselves to be. I think that's how I am. Yeah. But with everything and everything you've been doing for as long as you have, and you know the science and the data and the trends of different ecosystems and where they're going. First question, would you consider yourself an optimist? And then second question is, optimist, pessimist, whatever, how do you feel about our chances of straightening things out?
Ooh. Like everything, it's up and down. I see, like we did in, gosh, it was 1995, 94 and 95. We did a natural heritage inventory of Douglas County.
Okay.
It was different in those days than it is today. We had some wins. All you have to do is look on either side of the interstate and know we had some losses because there was some really pretty, like tallgrass prairie, foothills tallgrass prairie. There were prairie chickens out there at that particular point in time, or grouse. And so, we had some losses, and I think only with the bigger vision in mind, like we're out here to save lesser prairie chickens or whatever species we want to list, the lark buntings, and make sure they're there. We know right now we got quite a few of them. Maybe the lesser prairie chickens, not so much anymore. But we got to keep our eye on the big picture. And that's what I love about the work that I was able to participate in with the Nature Conservancy. We actually looked at whole regions and said, how much of this do we need to make sure that we have at least 10% of the vegetation types and such and such? You said, I know the science, and we can ramble through, but the bottom line is, if you have the big picture in mind and you look at the tools that have been developed, and I would say the threats of bad grazing, it's amazing to me in the short time I've been on this planet that I've been able to look out there and see a physical change in the state of the grasslands based on what I believe is a more knowledgeable and compassionate livestock industry. They're more educated. The kids are coming back. They've been to ag school. They're taking some of the knowledge from their grandparents or their parents, and they're applying that and modifying it to make sure that they're applying the best science. I see the difference out there. Yep. And so I really believe that part is good. Now they still have, they got to make a living, and that making a living sometimes would make a different decision than I would about conservation. But the other part of that is I see more and more that those landowners care. They're caught in a bind in some places. Their whole world is changing around them. Take the renewable energy stuff with all this. There's more income, but do you want, in some cases, these people do not want blinking red lights out their door.
Sure.
When they've been in a dark landscape all their life. And there's the whole local economy changes. Is it always good to have big money coming in constantly? I think some people would argue no. So anyway, I am I an optimist? I'm an optimist that we will be able to meet many, if not all of our goals. If I look at it one place at a time, I struggle sometimes because we're not going to win them all.
I had the pleasure of interviewing Chris Tompkins from Tompkins Conservation.
Whew.
Yeah. And she was talking about, sometimes people will ask her, are you hopeful? Are you hopeful? And she said she doesn't like that question. Thankfully, I hadn't asked her that, but she said, I don't like that question because you have to earn hope. You have to work and you have to make it happen. And that's what I admire about the team at CNC and all those ranching families that are getting, a little bit better with each generation. I mean, you can't ask for much more than that, than just trying to get a little bit better every time.
There's one other thing I'll add to what gives me hope, and that is there were very few organizations working on the grasslands when I got here.
Yeah.
And I would say very, very few. And we got into it, but people didn't follow us. The nature that's in the Great Plains became apparent more and more all through that time. So when I look at the number of other partner organizations who are from different angles here and there, but they're working to do it. And in many cases, we partner greatly with them. The Colorado Cattlemen's Agricultural Land Trust, most notably, but also, the Conservation Fund, the Wilderness Society, the Audubon Society, and just Ducks Unlimited, not always thought of as a prairie thing, but there's water out there. So, that's the other thing that gives me hope. There's a lot of people that are interested and from different angles. Southeastern Plains with the bison herd out there, there's a different angle, and some people like it and some people don't, but they're doing great conservation and they're bringing that picture out there. This is an amazing place and it's worthy of conservation, and we're going to do our part to do that, to save it. So that's a real hopeful thing for me, is the number of partners are amazing. And GOCO, Great Outdoors Colorado, and their funding source. Oh my gosh, that changed the world.
It really did. I mean, It really, really, really did. I had Chris Castilian on many years ago, but I need to revisit GOCO because there's so much great stuff comes from that. What's on the horizon for you that you're excited about when it comes to grasslands, conservation, or really anything? Any particular projects come to mind that are have you excited?
We are starting to have conversations within indigenous peoples, and some of it's out of respect where, yes, we don't have any federal lands, or any tribal lands around here, but we want your knowledge or your love of this or your cultural past to be a part of our thinking in this project.
Yep.
And that's happening in a really big way in some. And I think you'll hear some things in the not too distant future about that. And so on these Southern High Plains, as I start to reduce my geographical scope of actually working, even though it's a work of love for me on the prairie, I'm going to continue my focus on this Southern High Plains. And that Southern High Plains boundary is another line on a map. So occasionally we might dip into the Chihuahuan Desert, the northern part, or slip out into the tallgrass prairie or something. But I'm going to continue working in those amazing grasslands with all that diversity out there that's just struggling every year to make their life go on just one more time. And so I'll keep doing that. And that really, it just amazes me. And as long as I'm, what I tell my colleagues at the Nature Conservancy now that I'm supposedly retired is just, I'm not dead yet. So as long as I'm alive, I'm going to keep working on conservation, because that has developed into my mission in life. And sometimes it might be an international project. More often than not now, it's going to be in the prairie here.
You claim that you're retiring and that you're slowing down, but I don't think you are. How are you filling your time? Since, I know you're just going all over the place. TNC may not be taking up as much of your time, but your time is still being filled. What else have you been working on that you're excited about?
my wife and I bought a trailer, and the trailer is actually what they call a dry trailer. It's not in the shower. So she's particularly excited. And when she's excited, I'm excited.
All right. Nice.
So that's one thing. But I continue, Matt and I are planning a trip to Mongolia again. That'll be my 15th trip there. And I've learned so much from the Mongolian people. And of course they have many of the same problems, but at much higher cost usually than we have. If your livestock get all killed in a storm, it's not like you can just go replace them and things like that. But I've done conservation planning in the recent past in South Africa and Namibia.
Oh, cool.
Argentina still looms in my heart as a fantastic place that is still underserved. I mean, it's one of those daunting tasks. So I continue to probe into that area a little bit, but most of all, it's conservation planning, and I'll tell you why, is that every time that I have worked with a landowner on doing an assessment on their property, they can't believe the results of what lives out there that might have been under their feet, but not in their eyes. And that to me is just one of the most wonderful things in my life, is being able to sit there like with Joy Wooten, even though I wasn't supposed to have the lizard in the house. She can tell you the story and all about that lizard today. Steve and Joy will tell you that it's a globally imperiled lizard there. It's not particularly threatened. It lives in the rocky habitats, but she can tell you about it. And when we've worked with Steve and Joy in the past, they're wonderful people. They care about the wildlife out there. Some of them are more challenging for others than others, but they love it. And I find that all over. And so there are stories that I really can't tell. I promised landowners that I won't, but I've got one that's coming up, and this will be a little bit near and dear to you, in central to it's the Cumberland area in Tennessee.
Okay. Yeah.
And somebody that I had worked with in the past on conservation planning has a contract with a landowner who amassed 10,000 acres not too far from Nashville. Now, that's a massive piece of land in that neck of the woods. And they called me and said, "What's it going to take for us to get you to do a rapid ecological assessment out here? We really want to know before we develop our ranch plan." And that is just that's where I'm hoping that the world will end up one day, is that before we take action, we'll make sure that we can understand what it is we're taking action on and be intentional about our decisions. It won't always be in my favor, but it will be, I think, a much more conscientious way. And maybe that's where Chris Tompkins was coming from. We've got to earn it. And that means we have to be accountable to the life that we impact.
I love that. I got two more quick questions for you.
Yeah.
One, we could probably do a whole podcast about this, but I always want book recommendations. And they could be about the West, could be about conservation, could just be books that you liked that kind of shaped your worldview on things all the way back in Virginia. But any books come to mind that you would recommend to the folks that listen to this podcast and me?
Oh boy, that's interesting. I've got, I'm trying to look around the library here that I have, and unfortunately I didn't take the time to shape it up like I should have. There are some that are academic, and I'll just say that some academic books have been instrumental in shaping my thinking about and how I think about doing it. There's a book called The Big Empty that I've recently read, and I think that has been very instructional. I think there's also, when I look at Leaving Space for Nature by Nigel Dudley and Sue Stolten, it's a great book. And it's a little staunch, but these people have been in 90 countries around the world and studying all kinds of conservation. And amongst the things that they talk about is this is a hard thing because I believed differently for a long time. We don't have any pure nature anymore. All of it's been somewhat impacted, even if by our global climate change issues.
Sure.
If that's all. But we have to make more authentic decisions when we say what's the value of conservation in any one place rather than this is pristine. The word pristine is really, in my opinion, overused, because if we really believed that all the humans out there had a big impact, we ought to understand that impact and build on it. But we have to do it in a way that if we're doing nature conservation, that it's more authentic. The system's working better. So I really like that one. And then I just invite anybody to read books like, there's a new field guide for birders and naturalists and ecologists called Habitats of the World. We're the way it's organized, we're lumped in with some groups you may not expect. But that's because we're not the only people in the world that have, montane forest or alpine systems and all that. And I have learned a tremendous amount in looking through that book to see what systems are out there that are the same or different, and what's their status. So those are a couple. They're not necessarily the most exciting, but I'll give you one more. Okay. And that is Jane Goodall's book on hope.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, and I think that's something, she certainly has a very big perspective, and it's a little different approach than I ever thought that I would enjoy in a book. And it took me about halfway to get through it before I got to where I was really understood what was going on. And then the last couple of chapters were amazing.
Those are great. And I'll have links in the notes for folks listening. You can click through and check them out. Last question for you is just any parting words of wisdom, any way you want to wrap this up. Did I miss anything? You've had such an amazing life and had such great impact all over in some of my favorite spots. And so I'm just, any parting words?
It's hard in today's time for people, even me, to take a solid piece of time and spend in nature and really look at it. And I think I've said this so many times that I'm daring myself not to go into this. But the bottom line is, if we really look at the things that are out there, we'll see things that we never thought we would see. Some of them will be, you'll see the pronghorn antelope chasing the coyotes away from their babies. Most people don't see that.
Yeah.
And, so those are amazing things. But I think if we also have a conversation with nature when we're looking at it, what do you eat? How do you survive there? How do you keep from getting gobbled down by a bird? What do you do during drought? Why do your populations of you grasshoppers all of a sudden explode in some years, and most of the other years we can just see a few of you out there? If we really have a conversation with nature, an intelligent, inquisitive conversation, I think that our life can change from that, and we will make more conscientious decisions, whether it be who we support, what policies we support, what practices we support. But it'll also give us an appreciation, because you should ask that same question of every person managing land out there. How do you survive out here? Mm-hmm. What are you doing? And how do you make it work? How do you have this wildlife on your land in spite of that? So I believe that conversation with nature, we're shamed into thinking we can't have an out loud conversation with nobody's around, but we could.
Chris, I've learned so much from you over the years, mostly listening to you, and whether it's in a presentation in person or on YouTube or wherever. And so to get to have an actual conversation with you is really a dream come true. And I really appreciate everything you've done. It's so impactful. It means a lot. I've learned so much, and keep up the good work. I don't believe you're going to be slowing down anytime soon. But thank you.
Don't say that. But and likewise, thanks, Ed. You're one of the best communicators we've got out there for the kind of things, the broad suite of things that involve conservation and land management, and it's so appreciated. Not everybody can do it, because you can't do that in everything else, and I'm learning that in my 70s. So I appreciate that, and I look forward maybe one day to sitting down and just chatting with you over a meal or something.
Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I know your time is valuable, so it means the world that you spend it listening. If you want to support the podcast and help it to continue to spread and grow, there are a few ways you can help. Number one, pass it along to a friend or share it on social media. Word of mouth recommendations are the most powerful way for ideas to spread, so I'd love it if you could share the podcast with a few pals who might enjoy it. Number two, you can go to Apple Podcasts and give it a 5-star review. Good reviews encourage the Apple overlords to suggest the podcast to others. So there's a link in the notes if you'd be so kind as to give it 5 stars. Number three, you can support the podcast financially via Patreon, and there are exclusive benefits for those who do, including a monthly behind-the-scenes newsletter, Mountain and Prairie stickers, live and recorded video chats with podcast guests, and much more. Number four, I've also got 2 emails that I send out. The first is my weekly email called Good News from the American West, which I send out every Wednesday. It's only positive news, something we can all use a little more of these days. And my other email is my bi-monthly book recommendations email. One email every other month with 5, 6, 7, or 8 books that I've recently read and highly recommend. The thousands of people on both of these lists will vouch for me. No spam or other funny business. And number 5, finally, check out my online store for Mountain and Prairie stickers, shirts, and coffee mugs. I've got some really cool designs from Western artists with more on the way, so head to mountainandprairie.com/shop to check it all out. I'd love to connect with you. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, so look me up on either of those platforms by my name or through the links on my website. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for your support.